In this video, we're going to be looking at some further aspects of coding of PHP. So last week we looked at variables, arrays, and operators. Well, in this first video, we're going to look at a thing called conditionals. Now, if you remember back, if you took ICT 103, at the very end of the semester, you were asked to do a final project. And in that final project, you were asked to use Excel and use if, and, or, and not statements. Well, conditionals in PHP are basically taking those if statements. And so what we're going to do is, by creating these, in essence, truth statements, we're going to say, if something is true, execute this certain type of code. And if it's not, then either do something else or run a different piece of code. So it is basically asking these truth statements and seeing if particular conditions that we set up are met. In PHP, there are three different types of if statements or types of conditionals that we work with. The first is just the straight up if statement. This is something that it's basically just looking to see if the condition we present in the code is true or false. And if it's true, to execute the command that we put within it. The second type is the if-else statement. And in this case, it says to look at the code within to see if this is true. And if the condition is true, run a certain set of code. And if it's not true, and basically if it's anything other than that condition, then run a different set of code. And then finally we have the if, else statement. And really what this does is it allows us to stack conditions so that we can run multiple conditions that, depending on what the result is of each of these different conditions, if they are true or false, then it says to go and ask it another set of conditions, and then yet another set of conditions. That's really all this is about. So these are the three different types of conditionals that we have to work with. But before we move on to the actual code, let's kind of take a look at this from just a basic standpoint of asking ourselves some questions. So in this example, we're just creating a statement. And so we're asking, is it raining outside? And if you wanted to create this as a conditional or a condition, we would be looking for what the truth of this statement is. And so in other words, we're saying if it is raining outside, which would mean yes, then do something. And otherwise, it's false. So in this case, we're going to say, is it raining outside? And we are going to say that yes. So if it is raining outside, meaning that's a true statement, then we take an action or run a piece of code and say, better bring an umbrella. This would be an example of a very basic if statement. So let's go back and look through this again really quick. Here we're at the beginning again. If it is raining outside, this is our statement of truth. If it is raining outside, you better bring an umbrella. That is the essence of a truth statement and the essence of an if statement, which we are going to be tackling first. So a couple of things before we dive into the if statement itself. The logic is just as I presented in the previous example, but there is some syntax that we need to pay attention to. In your book and W3 schools, they will give you more details on this, but I just wanted to go over a few things in here so that you can understand, and it'll help you as you move through. So I'm going to skip over the variable for the moment and just look at the syntax of the if statement itself. So we start out with the word if, and then after that we have some stuff basically with parentheses wrapped around it. So we need the parentheses. The parentheses within that, this is the condition that needs to be met. And then after that we say if this condition, and then we open it with a curly bracket, and then we put what action needs to be taken. And then we close the curly bracket. So this is a basic if statement. So let's look through this now as to what it's actually saying. So what we're doing here is we're setting a variable called weather, And we're saying that that weather variable, the value of it is rain. So now if we look at the actual if statement itself, we're saying if the weather variable in this case equals, because we have two equal signs, the word rain, and in this case it does. And so that's our conditional, is that weather has to equal rain. And if it does, then in the next line we're saying echo or show on our screen that you better bring an umbrella. Now what happens in this case is if this statement is not true, for example, we change weather to sunny instead of rain, in our if statement we are still looking for the word rain. In the case of just a plain if statement, because there is absolutely nothing else on this particular page, it would show up as a white screen. I encourage you to take a look at this on your own. So type up this code, type in the variable, give it an actual variable. It can be rain, sunny, cloudy, take your pick, whatever you want, and then type up your if statement, and then type up your echo statement. And if it's true, it should show up with the whatever's in the echo statement. And if it's false, it will show up as a white screen. We'll look at what's next as to how we can avoid that white screen. That's when the if-else statement steps in. So you'll notice that our statement is pretty much the same here. But in this case, we have if, and here's our conditional again. It still is weather equals rain. And we're saying if that is true, then echo or display on the screen, better bring an umbrella. Else, meaning if that's not true, then echo a different statement, which in this case is don't forget your sunglasses. So this is really just testing a couple of conditional truth statements. In this case, it would show up as don't forget your sunglasses on screen because weather in this case, we've given it the value of sunny, so it certainly does not equal rain. To look at some of the syntax, we have the same thing as we would with our regular if statement, but now after that closing curly bracket of our if statement, we add the word else, and we open up another curly bracket, put in what we would do if this is a false statement, and then we close it with a curly bracket. So if you were to add this into your screen, you're going to see, depending on what you put in for the value of that variable, you're either going to see better bring an umbrella or don't forget your sunglasses. We have one more, and this basically, if you remember from the beginning of this video, I said an if, else statement. You'll also commonly hear me just refer to this as an else if statement. It allows us to test multiple variables before it finally just says, hey, if none of these are true, do this one. So let's go through our logic here. This time we've changed our variable over to cloudy, but we're still asking in the first one, we're looking for the condition is weather equal rain. And if it's true, we're saying, hey, you better bring an umbrella. If this is not true, then go to the next, which is else if. In other words, it's saying, okay, the first one is false, but if this one is true, and it gives us another conditional statement. And in this case, the conditional is weather equals sunny. And if this one is true, it says to display, don't forget your sunglasses. But if none of these, you could stack up a bunch of if, else if, and then you could have else if, with several different conditionals within them. But if finally at the end, if it doesn't meet any of those conditions, then you give it this final option, saying if none of those are true, then let's go to this last one, which is just else. And you'll notice in each of these cases, there's always the curly brackets that contain the action that's taken within, and there is the parentheses that holds the actual conditional itself. This is the case with if and else if. Notice, else does not have a conditional because it assumes that the others are not true, and it's just kind of encompassing everything else. Finally, we have this thing called nested ifs, and I have this on its own because it's not really a conditional type, but we can nest ifs, as this statement says, infinitely within other if statements. It happens occasionally that you need to do this, saying, okay, if this thing is true, then now we need to test this conditional and see if this one is true, and before you can determine what to do next. And actually I have that set up that we're going to be doing that in this week's one of our exercises. So you're going to get to test out this whole idea of a nested if. So for example, in this case, we just set some variables. These are just random numbers. So we have A equals 6, B equals 2, and C equals 5. What we're saying here, and you're going to see this is kind of complex, and please refer to your book. It's going to help you with understanding what these symbols mean. In this case, we are saying if, and there are two parts to this first if. We are saying if $A equals 1, and, that's the double and signs, it means and, that variable B equals 2. So both of these conditionals need to be true, and in this case you can see the if statement, we've got what looks like a whole bunch of parentheses, but we have a parentheses around the $sign equals 1, and parentheses around the $sign B equals 2, but those are each expressions. And so we still need the parentheses that wrap around the whole thing that is the actual if conditional, because we say that both of these things must be true. So then if we go into that, if A equals 1 and B equals 2, and then we're basically going inside, and if C is less than 10, then echo, this is a true statement in a nested if. So in other words, we're saying that A has to be 1, B has to be 2, and C can be anything that's less than 10. And if that's the case, then this is a true statement. Else, echo that this is a nested if is false. So take a look at this and think about it and think what you feel it would answer. Would it echo this is a true statement, or would it echo this is a false statement? And then I would recommend that you type it up and see what comes up and ask yourself, were you right? And if so, why? What was the logic? And if not, where do you think you went wrong? And thinking about it. And then go in and change those variables, the A, B, and C, and see what you get when you look at those. So that's the nested if, and they can get quite complicated, and it's usually best to not so much avoid, but keep them only nested in like a level. Don't keep nesting within nesting, because then that just gets really complicated in the logic. So something like this would be fine, and we are going to be looking at something like this in one of our exercises for this week. But with that, you are now ready to complete the first 3 tasks within the conditionals and loops exercise, and you're ready to go on to the next video, which is loops.